This is lecture 10A for History 111. I want to turn and talk about the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire is really the Eastern Roman Empire. And it would continue on for quite a long time, and it would change considerably over the course once the Western Roman Empire had collapsed. And so historians refer to it in a different way as the Byzantine Empire. Now, in one sense, this name makes no sense whatsoever because Byzantium was the original city that's today Istanbul. And Byzantium was originally the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, so it makes certain sense there. But Constantine had renamed Byzantium as Constantinople, and it remained that throughout the entire life of the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine Empire is named after a city that didn't exist for the whole time the Byzantine Empire existed. Nonetheless, historians call it the Byzantine Empire. Now, we saw before that the Roman Empire originally stretched entirely around the Mediterranean, and it stretched considerably up into Europe. It had the strip of North Africa and then the big chunk of Egypt, and it extended into the Middle East a fair amount. But the majority of its territory is in Europe. Spain, Italy, France, Romania, the Balkans, Greece, and then for a while England. Now, and we saw in a previous lecture that Diocletian, who reigned from 284 to 305, had split the empire in half in order to better govern it. And so he had created essentially two bureaucracies, two emperors, and he had divided it in half. And the dividing line went roughly through modern day Croatia and then down into modern day Libya. And so the eastern half of the Roman Empire was governed from Constantinople or Byzantium, which is today Istanbul, Turkey, and the Western Roman Empire was governed from Rome. Now, we saw that Diocletian, retired in 305, and that the successor emperors got into a civil war, and Constantine wound up conquering the whole empire again. He moved the capital of the whole empire to Constantinople. But he ruled the entire empire. But after his death, there were some periods of split and some periods of reconnection. But the two empires finally split permanently in 395. Now, they still cooperated. They still thought of themselves as all Roman. They still had all sorts of relationships. And in fact, the East shared a lot of its tax money with the West. But they were administratively separated from 395 onward. Now, the big thing that I talked about with the fall of the Western Roman Empire was this invasion of barbarians, right? The Germanic tribes from northern Europe, and then the Goths, Visigoths and Ostrogoths and then later the Huns, etc., from what we would today call Ukraine, north of the Black Sea. And what's interesting is that the Eastern Roman Empire did much better with barbarians than the West did, and there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, the Eastern Roman Empire was, as I said last time, much wealthier. There were a number of major cities in the east. There was Athens, there was Constantinople, there was Antioch, there was Jerusalem, there was Alexandria, and these were major trade centers. And there was a lot of manufacturing. There was a lot of luxury good production, etc. And the east was also the terminus of the Silk Roads, right? The Silk Roads connected to the east. And so the Silk Road's traffic passed through Constantinople and Damascus and Antioch and places like that. And so the East was really wealthy, and it was very densely populated compared to the West. Now, the West had Rome, as I mentioned, as its sole big city, and then it had a bunch of really small cities like Marseille, which weren't significant cities, and the West was just generally much more sparsely populated. France and Spain and North Africa were not nearly as populated as Greece and Anatolia and Egypt and Syria. And so once the split had happened, the East actually had to help the West. The East had to supply armies, but the East also had to supply a significant amount of money to the West. But even with that help, the East was always better able to defend itself than the West. And there were a number of reasons for this. Partly, one of the reasons was just simple geography, in that the peoples coming into the Roman Empire were coming from Central Asia or Northern Europe, and there tends to be a lot of flat plains there. But to turn down to get into the Eastern Roman Empire, you basically have to go through Constantinople, which is heavily fortified, or you have to go around the other side of the Black Sea, which is the Caucasus Mountains. So it's actually just a little difficult to get there. Now, there are places like the Balkans and Greece that are in the Eastern Roman Empire, which are fairly easily invaded. The West, on the other hand, there's wide open plains across Poland and Germany and into France and Hungary and et cetera. So, I mean, yes, you have to get over the Alps to get into Italy, but the rest of it's pretty much a clear shot. So, but there are other reasons as well. And the gist of it is that the East, because it had a much bigger population and much more money, was better able to maintain its fortresses, was better able to equip its armies, was better able to maintain its legions, and therefore they were able to put much bigger and much better armies and fortifications in the way of the barbarians. And so what tended to happen was, with the exception of the Visigoths, which I talked about before, what tended to happen was that the barbarians would simply bounce. They'd try to get into the Eastern Roman Empire, run into too much resistance, and then they would simply go farther north and west to try to get into the Western Roman Empire, where it was much easier, right? And so the East generally didn't suffer that much. And the one exception, as I mentioned, was the Visigoths, who basically got into the Eastern Roman Empire, then got into an argument with the Romans. And then went on this tear all the way through. They actually killed the Roman emperor in a battle, and then they went on this tear through Greece, but then they wound up in the West, right? And the others, the Huns and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals and the Franks and the Angles and the Saxons, they all tended to wind up farther west. They generally ran into a lot of resistance in the East, and so they just pushed west. So. The West generally came out of this period of barbarian invasions fairly well, right? Now, the East came out fairly well. The West did not. When the West collapsed when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was killed in 476, the emperor in the East was a guy named Zeno, and Zeno. His immediate impulse was, well, I've got to reconquer the West. I've got to reestablish control of the West. But he didn't have the resources at that moment to go invade the West. So instead, what he did is he actually turned to a friend of his, Theodoric. Now, Theodoric was a Goth. He was an Ostrogoth. And the Ostrogoths were a kingdom of people who lived outside of the Roman Empire, north of the Caucasus in today's Ukraine. Not north of the Caucasus, north of the Black Sea in Ukraine. But the Ostrogoths had been conquered by the Huns, but then they had gotten free of the Huns, and they had a deal with the Eastern Roman Empire. They had alliances, and one of the ways they sealed those alliances was that they would exchange hostages. And usually, what this meant was that the king of the Ostrogoths generally had to send his oldest son to be raised in the palace of the Eastern Roman Emperor, and the assumption was, the explicit agreement was that if the Ostrogoths broke their treaty with the Romans, then they would kill the Ostrogoth king's son. And, well, Theodoric was the Ostrogoth king's son, and he was sent to be raised in the palace of the Eastern Roman Emperor, and Zeno was the son of the Eastern Roman Emperor, so these two actually were about the same age, and they grew up together. They were really good friends, right? And so then when Theodoric became the king of the Ostrogoths and Zeno became the king of the Eastern Roman Emperor, they remained friends. Well, Zeno actually said to Theodoric, look, the power has collapsed in the West, and it's just sitting there. Why don't you go conquer the Western Roman Empire, and then you could become the Western Roman Emperor again, and I'll recognize you, and we'll set up the deal, all right? And so Theodoric goes, and he invades Italy, and he actually succeeds in conquering all of Italy. He's a really competent guy, but his reign he's a good king, but he does not create enough stability so that when he dies, it falls apart, and there's all sorts of fighting amongst different barbarian groups and old Roman groups, etc. And so and Zeno and Theodoric basically die at the same time. So that experiment doesn't work, right? And really that's, Zeno thought he could just put the West right back together, but people began to realize, well, the West might have bigger problems now that Theodoric had sort of failed to reestablish the Western Roman Empire. So the East carries on, and we'll talk about what happens in the West when we get into medieval Europe. But after Zeno, the next Eastern Roman Empire is a guy named Justinian. And he's really a fantastically capable and competent emperor. And he would actually, do a number of things, which I'll talk about in a minute. But Justinian is interesting. He was actually a very he had the personality of a manager. He loved doing paperwork. He loved to just pore over, documents and keep track of records. And he loved to make decisions. And he would, they call him the sleepless emperor because you could see the light on in his office all the time. But he was not the kind of guy who had like a big vision and was not the sort of flamboyant type who could move people. He was more of a manager type. He was a great administrator, put it that way. But he happened to be married to a woman who was really interesting, Theodora. She was actually the daughter of, best guess here is that her father was a bear trainer at the racetracks. And what they would do is they would have, they had chariot racing was a huge sport in the Eastern Roman Empire. And people would bet on it, and there were actually sort of leagues and teams and things like this. And it was, think of the NFL today, and you have the right idea. And they would have shows between races and things like dancing bears or sometimes even fights, gladiator contests, whatever. Well, Theodora's father was apparently a bear trainer, and so she grew up essentially in a circus. And she actually was a dancer for a while. She, fairly exotic dancer, probably. There were some people who alleged that she was also a prostitute for a while. That seems feasible, but the people who said that also didn't like her, so they might have been just making up lies. But anyway, she was a really flamboyant person, a really powerful personality, and she catches Justinian's eye and gets him to fall in love with her, and he marries her. And this actually saved his reign, because very early on in his reign, Justinian tried to impose a tax on all the betting on the chariot races. And this set off widespread rioting in Constantinople, rioting so bad that Justinian was actually meeting with his generals, and they were saying, we can't control this, we can't stop this, we just don't know if we can do this. And Justinian was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And they said, well, you should probably sneak out of the city in disguise and then go try to raise an army elsewhere and then come back and sort of reconquer the city. And it really looked like he might, and if he did that, he might actually, lose control entirely and be ousted as emperor. But Theodora comes in and she's in the middle of this. She's like, what the heck are you guys talking about? You're talking about giving up? You're talking about running away? We're not going to do that. And she actually, she finishes up by saying, I'm living in purple. Purple was the color of royalty. The emperor wore purple. She's like, I'm going to die in purple rather than live in any other color. And you're going to die in purple too. And the general's like, okay, yeah, well, let's go do it. And so she gets everybody fired up. And so they decide to actually put down the revolt, and they succeed and by fighting it out. And so he establishes his control. Now, Justinian would actually, he also, like Zeno before him, had the dream of reconquering the Western Roman Empire. Now, he's not going to just try to farm it out to the Ostrogoths. He actually, he's a great administrator. He does wonderful things for the tax system. He does wonderful things for the government's budgets, etc. So he actually gets the government in a much better place. And he says, I think I can go reconquer the West. And so he gets a general, Belisarius, who's a brilliant general, and he says to Belisarius, you equip your army, and then you go. And so Belisarius actually starts from Egypt, and he goes across North Africa, and he first goes after the Vandals, who were a barbarian group from Northern Europe who had tore through, France and Italy, and then Spain, and then had crossed over to North Africa and had conquered a bunch of North Africa. Belisarius goes after the Vandals first, and he knocks off them, and he conquers a big chunk of North Africa, and then he crosses over to southern Italy, and he starts plowing up southern Italy, and he's just fighting, continuously all the way up Italy, and he had actually conquered most of Italy by 565. I'm sorry, he had conquered most of Italy by the 530s, but then Justinian gets into a war with the Sassanids on the Persian Empire, which is to his east, and he has to pull Belisarius back. And then when Justinian dies in 565, the Byzantines really control most of Italy, but they really can't. They can't maintain control of it, and they just don't have the resources because, as I'll talk about a little later, they get stuck in this big war, really long war, about 100 years of fighting the Persians, and as a result, they just don't have the resources to hold on to Italy rather. So the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, would actually maintain some holds on chunks of Italy, but they would essentially, after 565, they would just lose most of Italy again. There would be more barbarian invasions. A group called the Lombards come in, and they conquer a big chunk of Italy. And so the Byzantines would hold on to some parts down at the sort of the heel of the boot for a long time, but essentially the Byzantines are no longer trying to conquer the West, and this is really the last chance, the last try of any Byzantine emperor to try to reconquer the West and reconstitute the Western Roman Empire. After that, nobody even tries. Okay? So the last thing I want to talk about is the Justinian Code. Justinian was, as I said, he's this fantastic emperor who's an administrator. He just loves administration. So one of the things he realized was that the Roman law had gotten pretty convoluted over the centuries. Now, initially, the Roman Republic had these 12 tables. They had written the laws on 12 tables. And Roman law was kind of fascinating because previous law was what we call common law, which is where kings would make decisions on a case, and then they'd just write it down, and that would set a precedent, and they would say, okay, that's how we're going to handle that sort of thing in the future. But there was no sense of that the law was systematic or that it had some common precepts or some basic ideas, rights, theories, etc., that shaped the law. It was just a whole bunch of decisions, right? And so the Romans, with these 12 tables, had laid out a bunch of basic concepts that they were going to shape all the laws. Every law had to sort of conform to these basic concepts, and it made their law much more systematic. However, over the course of the centuries of empire, when different emperors could just write laws, Roman law had gotten kind of messed up again. And there was lots and lots and lots of different laws, and it wasn't clear sometimes these two laws were both enacted by different emperors, and they seemed to contradict each other, which one is actually right, etc. And so Justinian had a whole bunch of legal scholars sit down, and he was actually himself involved in this process. And they just went through all of Roman law, and they basically took every single law and said, does this fit the basic concepts, and can we make this systematic? And they would tweak things, and they would throw things out, and they would develop things, and they developed this thing called the Justinian Code, and it was really just the most amazingly advanced legal code the world had ever seen by the time it was finished, because it was so systematic, and it was all based on these common precepts and concepts that shaped everything else, and all the laws had to be consistent with each other. There weren't any inconsistencies. And so the Justinian Code is fantastic, and when Western Europeans would later discover the Justinian Code, they would adopt a lot of it. Right? And so it would become a major force in shaping medieval European law much later. But the Byzantines would hold on to the Justinian Code for essentially another 900 years, as long as the Byzantine Empire would survive. Right? Now, one thing I want to just mention in passing is that Justinian was really the last Roman emperor. Justinian spoke Latin. He thought of himself as a Roman emperor. He acted like a Roman emperor, etc. But after him, without the West and without dealing with the West, the Byzantine Empire really begins to shift because the vast majority of the population in the Byzantine Empire is in Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. And those populations all speak Greek. And so the Byzantine Empire essentially shifts from being a sort of a Latin-based government to being a Greek-based government, and future emperors would speak Greek, essentially. and they would think of themselves as Greek. And so the Byzantine Empire begins to sort of transform when it's cut off from the West and it's cut off from Rome. I'll talk about some other ways in part B of this lecture, but that's it for part A.